So today we're looking at what might be, honestly, the ultimate survival story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if you're buying a house or, starting a business or even just planning your life, there's this baseline assumption you make every single day.
Right, without even realizing it.
Exactly.
Right.
You assume the ground beneath your feet is permanent. You assume the map remains the map. Like if you build a home, the land it sits on will physically be there tomorrow.
Right.
But what if you had to plan for your family's future or manage a whole economy in a place where that foundational given simply does not exist?
Hmm.
Today's deep dive is into a really fascinating set of sources. We've got a comprehensive 15-page academic synthesis report, plus a massive amount of World Duck data spanning from 1960 all the way to 2023.
It's an incredibly dense data set.
It really is, and is all detailing the socioeconomic reality of Kiribati. This is a small island nation that contributes practically zero to global climate change, yet finds itself on the absolute front lines of its consequences. We are going to figure out how a country survives when the very map it occupies is literally at risk of being erased.
And, that is what makes this so much more than just a geographic curiosity. When you look at the raw data, and like you said, we're talking about a multidimensional synthesis of macroeconomic, health, demographic, and environmental indicators, you realize that Kiribati is basically a laboratory for human resilience.
Right.
Looking at this isn't just about studying a small island state. We are looking at a microcosm of the most extreme challenges facing our entire global system today.
Because I was reading this thinking, you listening to this might be dealing with everyday stresses, but the daily stress for this nation is completely existential.
Exactly. How do you manage a massive demographic shift under that pressure? How do you pivot an entire public health system? How do you build an economy when you are geographically isolated and physically vulnerable? The strategies they're employing, the failures they're navigating, they hold really profound lessons for how any society deals with existential pressure.
So to even begin to understand how the people of Kiribati live and work, we have to look at the physical board they're playing on.
The underlying logic of everything.
Yeah, the geographic reality presented in the report is just staggering. It focuses on core land areas that are unfathomably small. We're talking about a concentration of just 10 square kilometers.
10 square kilometers.
Right. Imagine fitting the beating heart of your nation into an area roughly the size of a large airport, and then setting that against millions of square miles of massive, open, territorial ocean.
It dictates every single policy decision they make. You literally cannot separate the socioeconomic data from that physical geography.
You can't. But here is the statistic from the report that I just cannot get out of my head. Over 67.5% of the land area sits at an elevation of less than 5 meters.
5 meters.
5 meters. I was trying to visualize this earlier. If you're standing on the beach, you could physically throw a baseball higher than the highest point of land for the vast majority of the entire country.
Yeah, and when your physical ceiling is that low, the margin for error is non-existent. When you have a geography like that, global sea level rise isn't some distant environmental debate. It is an immediate matter of national security.
It's right at their doorstep.
Literally. A storm surge or a king tide doesn't just flood a basement. It salinizes the freshwater table, it destroys crops, and it fundamentally alters the habitability of the land. And it's not just the human infrastructure at risk either.
Right, the biodiversity data.
Exactly. The report logs 24 threatened fish species and 6 threatened bird species. And that biodiversity is deeply intertwined with their cultural heritage and their subsistence survival.
But wait, hold on. I'm looking at this environmental data, and there is a massive paradox here that just makes absolutely no sense to me.
The emissions data.
Yeah, we know they're facing this existential climate threat, right?
Right.
But the data shows their CO2 emissions intensity is practically a rounding error on the global scale. It's a mere 0.29 kilograms per unit of GDP. They are barely emitting anything.
Nothing at all in the grand scheme.
And on top of that, they're actually doing the work to transition. They've increased their renewable energy generation from less than 1% up to a really impressive 16.3%.
Right.
Yet, the exact same report reveals that 100% of the population is exposed to PM2.5 air pollution levels that exceed World Health Organization guidelines. How is that physically possible? It's like being stuck on a flat raft in a rising swimming pool, and you didn't even turn the hose on. If they have barely any cars and no heavy industry, why does the WHO say the air they breathe every day fails safety standards?
Well, what's fascinating here is that this is the exact kind of data point that requires us to look completely past the surface level. When you hear the term PM 2.5, which, just refers to microscopic particulate matter in the air, our brains are conditioned to picture factories.
Yeah, industrial smog, endless traffic jams.
Exactly. We think of industrial output, but PM 2.5 is just a measurement of particle size. It doesn't tell you the origin. In a small, remote coral atoll environment like Kiribati, PM 2.5 includes entirely natural aerosols.
Wait, really? Like what?
While the ocean winds whip up sea salt aerosols, which actually make up a massive portion of that particulate matter. Then you add in the natural dust from the dried coral and sand. And crucially, you have the localized burning of biomass.
Like for cooking.
Yes, for daily cooking or managing waste, because dealing with solid waste on a tiny atoll is incredibly difficult. You don't have sprawling landfills.
So it's not that they're secretly running a bunch of coal plants, it's the ocean itself, combined with just the reality of daily life on an isolated island.
Precisely. It's just wild to think that environmental metrics designed for London or Beijing look completely different when applied to the Pacific.
Right.
The metrics look terrible on paper, but the mechanism behind them is entirely different.
That makes so much more sense.
And it highlights a broader point about their place in the world. Despite contributing effectively zero to the greenhouse gases warming the planet, Kiribati is actively participating in global environmental governance.
Right, they have a huge voice there.
They have to. Their survival is the baseline logic of all their national policies. They advocate on the global stage because they are absorbing the consequences of a party they didn't even attend.
So if you are a citizen of Kiribati and you're faced with this incredibly precarious physical environment, you might assume the society is in a state of paralysis.
Sure, that would be the assumption.
But the sources show something entirely different. The most dynamic, rapidly changing asset the country has isn't its infrastructure, it's its people. The demographic data we have here from 1960 to 2023 tells a phenomenal story of transformation.
It really is a textbook example of a demographic transition, but playing out under extreme pressure.
Let's walk through the numbers because they are striking. If you go back to 1960, the total fertility rate in Kiribati was roughly 6.44 children per woman. That is a massively expanding population.
Right, huge families.
But today, that number has dropped dramatically down to about 3.15. And because families are having significantly fewer children, the shape of the entire society is changing. Historically, the 0 to 14 age demographic made up around 44% of the entire population.
Almost half the country was under 15.
Exactly. But today, that has slid down to 34.7%. And this leads to what seems to be the most critical demographic metric in the entire report, the youth dependency ratio. It has fallen from a towering historical high of 83.1% all the way down to around 72.3%.
Let's break down why that specific ratio matters so much. Because it is vital. The youth dependency ratio is simply the number of young dependence kids who need to be fed, clothed, and educated compared to the number of working-age adults.
Okay.
If you are an investor or a policymaker looking at a developing economy, this is the magic window. Economists call this the demographic dividend window.
So explain how that dividend actually pays out for the listener, because on the surface, fewer kids just sounds like fewer people to take care of you when you're older.
Think about it like a household budget. If a family has 6 children, the working parents are stretched incredibly thin. Every single dollar earned goes immediately to basic survival food, basic clothing, maybe rudimentary shelter. There is zero surplus capital.
They're just treading water.
Exactly. And the government faces the exact same problem on a macro scale. All their tax revenue goes into frantically building enough basic primary schools and clinics just to keep up with the exploding population.
Right.
But when that fertility rate drops to 3 kids per family, the ratio of workers to dependents improves. Suddenly, that same household has surplus income. They aren't just surviving. They can invest, they can save money, they can buy better food, and crucially, they can invest deeply in the education of those 3 children.
So the government stops having to build 10 new schools a year just to tread water. And instead, they can take that same budget and hire better teachers for the schools they already have.
Precisely. It frees up capital across the entire society. You suddenly have a surging workforce with fewer mouths to feed at home. Countries like South Korea and Japan utilize this exact demographic window in the mid-20th century to absolutely supercharge their economic development.
But there's a catch, right? This window doesn't stay open forever.
No, not at all. It is a strict race against the clock. You have a window of maybe 2 to 3 decades where your working age population vastly outnumbers your dependents.
Yeah.
If you fail to translate that temporary surplus energy into lasting economic wealth and infrastructure, the window inevitably closes. Those workers get old, they retire, and suddenly you have an aging population with no accumulated wealth to support them.
Which brings us to the most urgent question. If you have this golden, temporary window of demographic opportunity, how well is Kiribati actually investing in this youth bulge? Are they building the human capital they need to survive the 21st century?
The data gives us a really detailed and frankly somewhat conflicted report card on that.
Yeah, let's start with the massive successes, because the logistical hurdles here are insane. Delivering education across a scattering of remote coral atolls is an administrative nightmare. Yet their primary net enrollment rate is sitting remarkably high at around 89%.
That's a huge logistical victory.
And even better, the completion rate for junior high school among people over 25 has skyrocketed. It went from a historical low of just 10.5% all the way up to roughly 69.7%.
That is a staggering generational leap. I mean, in a single lifetime, they went from basic education being an absolute rarity to it being the overwhelming norm.
But the deeper you read into the human capital data, the more complex the picture gets. Let's look at the Human Capital Index, or the HCI.
Right.
This metric calculates the amount of human capital a child born today can expect to accumulate by age 18, factoring in health, education, survival. The overall average for Kiribati is 0.479. But when you split it by gender, something really fascinating emerges.
A gender gap.
Yeah. The HCI for women is 0.509, while for men it's only 0.436. And if you look at the gender parity index in schools, it meets or exceeds 1.0 at both the primary and secondary levels, which means the system mathematically favors females. Girls are significantly outperforming and out-enrolling boys.
It's a remarkable achievement in gender equity, especially in a developing context where, female education is often the very first thing sacrificed when resources are scarce.
Right.
But from a macroeconomic perspective, a widening gap where boys fall significantly behind becomes a very sharp double-edged sword.
Because if you need that entire demographic dividend to pay off, you can't have half your workforce stalling out.
Exactly.
Which brings me to the major inefficiency glaring at us from the data. The report shows that 17.7% of all students in Kiribati are overage for their grade level. Meanwhile, the secondary student-teacher ratio is sitting comfortably around 17 to 20. So let me try to map this out.
Go for it.
It's like the government has managed to build this massive, newly paved superhighway of education. They've got great access, plenty of lanes, high enrollment, but there are constant gridlock traffic jams everywhere because almost 18% of the cars are moving at the completely wrong speed.
Right.
And surprisingly, the young women are the ones driving the sports cars, smoothly navigating the highway, while the young men are the ones whose engines keep stalling in the middle lanes, backing up the whole system.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the structural drag on the economy. Let's unpack what it actually means to have nearly 18% of your students being overage. In a highly efficient education system, a 10-year-old is in the 5th grade, a 15-year-old is in the 10th grade.
Sure.
When a massive chunk of your student body is older than they should be, it generally points to one major culprit, which is grade repetition.
They're failing and having to take the class again.
Yes. Or they're starting school very late, or pausing their education for long periods to work or help at home. From an economic standpoint, grade repetition is a catastrophic loss of efficiency.
How so?
Think about it. Every single time a student repeats a grade, the government is paying for that year of teacher time, classroom space, and resources twice. Furthermore, it delays that individual's entry into the productive workforce by a full year. It literally clogs the arteries of that superhighway you mentioned.
And if the young men are disproportionately the ones repeating grades or dropping out, what does that do to the society long term?
Well, it creates immense social friction. If a large segment of your male population is left behind in human capital accumulation, it can lead to higher male unemployment, increased crime, and just a deep lack of skilled labor. in sectors that are crucial for the physical development of the island.
Right.
For that demographic window to yield actual wealth, the entire cohort needs to be operating near their highest potential. You can't leave half the population behind.
So we have this generation of young people, especially highly educated young women,
Yeah.
graduating and ready to work. But where are they actually driving to? When they exit that educational superhighway, what kind of jobs actually exist on a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific?
That's the million-dollar question.
This leads us directly into the macroeconomic data. And frankly, looking at these GDP charts is pretty stressful.
The volatility is extreme. It completely defies the standard models of slow, steady economic growth.
It really does. Instead of a smooth upward curve, the GDP growth rate swings wildly. For instance, the data logs a massive 23.9% spike in economic growth in 2014.
Huge growth.
But then, followed just a few years later by a brutal contraction of negative 11.7% in 2019. Now, over the long haul, yes, GDP per capita, measured in constant 2015 US dollars, has grown from around $1,473 to about $1,930.
So there is growth.
There is, but it's a chaotic ride. And when we look at the actual composition of the economy, it is incredibly lopsided. Services make up a staggering 67.1% of the GDP.
Right.
Industry and construction hover around 11.4%. And manufacturing is almost non-existent at just 4.7%.
I have to push back on this structure a bit.
Oh.
Yeah, I look at this and think, if you are an isolated island nation prone to climate shocks, isn't an economy completely dominated by services a recipe for disaster? You can't eat a service job. When a cyclone hits and cuts off the supply chain, a robust manufacturing or heavy industry sector seems vital. Why don't they build things? It's a completely natural assumption to make. We're conditioned by the history of large developed nations to believe that the path to wealth requires building factories and manufacturing physical goods.
Exactly.
But microstates operate under a completely different set of physical laws. Their economy isn't lopsided because of a lack of ambition. It is dictated by the unforgiving realities of geographic isolation and economies of scale.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't a smart, educated workforce in Kiribati manufacture goods?
To manufacture goods competitively on the global market, a country needs three basic ingredients: cheap and abundant raw materials, incredibly cheap energy to run the factories, and massive deep water shipping infrastructure to export the finished products at a high volume.
And Kiribati doesn't have those.
Kiribati has literally none of those things. Imagine trying to start a furniture factory there. You would have to import the wood from thousands of miles away, import the expensive diesel fuel to run the generators to power the saws,
No.
and then pay exorbitant shipping costs to send the finished chair back across the ocean to a buyer. The chair would cost 10 times what it costs to make in Vietnam or Mexico. It is mathematically impossible for them to compete in physical manufacturing.
So they literally have no choice but to pivot to the service sector.
Exactly. Services like public administration, digital labor, or selling fishing licenses, they don't require heavy physical supply chains. They require human capital, which, as we just discussed, is exactly what they're building. But your concern about volatility is still highly relevant. What happens when an external shock hits?
Right. If the GDP behaves like a farmer who only grows one extremely sensitive crop, let's say an exotic orchid, if the weather is absolutely perfect, the farmer makes a fortune, like that 23.9% spike.
Right.
But if it rains too hard or the global market for orchids drops, the farmer is completely wiped out. There's no shock absorber.
That is exactly where the primary sector comes in, and why the data highlights agriculture and fisheries as the absolute bedrock of the nation, even if they don't produce the lion's share of the cash GDP.
Let's look at that data.
Look at the food production index in the report. Despite the wild swings in the macroeconomy and agricultural growth itself fluctuating between negative 2.8% and positive 9.2%, the overall food index has steadily crept up to roughly 97.3 based on a 2014 to 2016 baseline of 100.
So even when the formal economy contracts by almost 12%, people aren't starving.
Precisely. Agriculture and local fishing act as the ultimate organic social safety net. When the global economy sneezes, when tourism drops, or when external shocks cause service sector jobs to dry up, the population falls back on subsistence, agriculture, and the ocean.
That makes a lot of sense.
The service sector generates the capital required to modernize the state, but the primary sector sustains life. It is the absolute floor of their survival.
But even with that agricultural safety net, a glaring mathematical problem remains. If they aren't manufacturing anything and they have to import nearly all their modern goods, fuel, medicine, building materials, processed food, how do they balance the books?
The trade balance data is tough to look at.
It's jaw-dropping. We are looking at what the report bluntly calls extreme external dependency. Their imports sit at an astronomical $293 million, compared to an absolute trickle of physical exports at roughly $15 million.
Yeah, a structural trade deficit of that magnitude, importing roughly 20 times more physical goods than you export, would trigger a currency crisis and bankrupt a normal country in a matter of months.
So how are the lights still on? The data outlines a few lifelines. First, there's service trade, which makes up anywhere from 30% to 70% of their GDP. Then there's a massive chunk of what they call secondary income, essentially current transfers from abroad totaling around $107 million.
But there's a bigger engine.
Right. The true engine keeping this entire nation afloat is ODA official development assistance, foreign aid. The numbers here are almost hard to comprehend. The report points out that ODA frequently exceeds the country's entire gross capital formation. In some years, foreign aid reaches 144.2% and even spiked to 169.2% of capital formation.
Let's translate gross capital formation so the scale of this is clear to everyone. Capital formation is essentially the total value of all the new physical assets a country builds or acquires in a given year. The new roads, the new hospitals, the new schools, the heavy machinery.
So if a country builds $100 million worth of infrastructure in a year, you are saying that foreign aid donors handed them $144 million that same year.
Yes. The outside investors are pouring in $1.44 in aid for every single dollar the country manages to build or acquire in physical assets. It is a level of dependency that fundamentally alters how a state operates.
It reminds me of a Silicon Valley startup. Imagine a tech company that has successfully raised massive rounds of venture capital year after year. The capital they raise vastly exceeds the actual physical value of the company, and they haven't launched a profitable product yet.
Right.
But the investors, in Kiribati's case, foreign nations like Japan, the UK, and Australia, believe in the project, or at least have a vested interest in keeping the company alive, so they keep funding the burn rate. They are literally keeping the lights on.
It's a really great analogy, but we have to add a heavy geopolitical twist to it. Political economists refer to this as a rent-and-aid economic model.
A rent-and-aid model.
Yeah. A rent state is one that generates income not by making things, but by leasing out its natural resources. In Kiribati's case, the primary rent comes from their massive exclusive economic zone in the ocean. They sell highly lucrative licenses to foreign fleets to come in and fish their waters.
Oh, I see.
And the aid part is that massive, continuous influx of ODA from international donors. But here is the critical vulnerability you have to consider if you are looking at this model. What happens to a sovereign nation when its public investment, its infrastructure development, and its basic fiscal survival are almost entirely dependent on the geopolitical goodwill and the domestic tax budgets of foreign capitals thousands of miles away?
It means their economic sovereignty is completely outsourced. If there is a domestic recession in Tokyo, or a political shift in Canberra, or a change in foreign policy priorities in London, the ripple effect doesn't just hit a specific industry in Kiribati. It threatens to collapse the foundation of their entire national budget.
Exactly. The leaders of Kiribati aren't just managing a domestic economy. They are constantly, tirelessly managing a complex portfolio of international patron relationships. They have to ensure that the strategic, diplomatic, and moral arguments for supporting Kiribati remain compelling enough that the ODA keeps flowing. It is an incredibly fragile geopolitical tightrope.
And as if managing that geopolitical tightrope isn't complex enough, the data reveals that this massive influx of foreign aid and the push for modernization has created an entirely new, deeply tragic crisis right at home.
The health paradox.
Yeah, let's look at the public health data on page 11. On one hand, the investment from that ODA has yielded miraculous results. The medical improvements over the last few decades have caused life expectancy for women to leap from a historical average of just 49 years up to roughly 66 years today.
That's decades of life given back to families.
It is. And even more profoundly, infant mortality has absolutely plunged. It dropped from an agonizing 144 deaths per 1,000 live births all the way down to about 40. They took foreign aid and used it to conquer infectious diseases and save thousands of young lives.
It is arguably the most successful metric in the entire report. It is the undeniable proof that international development assistance can have a profound, tangible, and moral impact.
But the tragedy of that success is what comes next. As infectious diseases were beaten back, the data shows that non-communicable diseases, or NCDs, rushed in to take their place. They took over completely.
Yeah.
According to the report, NCDs now account for a staggering 72.8% of all deaths in the country. We are talking about an epidemic of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and chronic respiratory conditions.
Right.
So we saved the infants and we extended lifespans, but now the imported modern lifestyle is what's killing the adults. How does a health system even begin to pivot from fighting viruses to fighting diet and lifestyle?
What the data is capturing here is called the epidemiological transition. And in isolated microstates, it happens with whiplash-inducing speed. To understand how and why this happens, you have to connect the health data back to that economic dependency we just discussed. When a country relies on massive trade deficits and foreign aid, they aren't just importing steel and medicine, they're importing a fundamentally foreign way of life. The traditional Kiribati diet, based on fresh fish, coconut, and root vegetables, is highly nutritious and incredibly adapted to their environment. But as the country modernizes, that traditional diet is rapidly replaced by cheap, shelf-stable, highly processed imported foods, spam, white rice, refined sugars, sugary beverages.
Because it's cheaper to ship a can of processed meat across the ocean than it is to build a complex supply chain for fresh food.
Exactly. And simultaneously, as the economy shifts from the primary sector to that 67% service sector, the daily physical activity of the population plummets. You move from manual labor, fishing, and farming to sitting at a desk in public administration. You combine a massive influx of refined, processed calories with a sudden, sedentary lifestyle, and you create the absolute perfect biological environment for metabolic diseases to explode.
Okay, but surely the health system that's successfully slashed infant mortality can just retarget its resources to fight diabetes, right?
That is where the structural nightmare begins. A public health system is not easily reprogrammed. Think about how you fight an infectious disease like measles or malaria. It requires clear episodic interventions. You deliver vaccines, you distribute antibiotics, you hand out mosquito nets. You run a campaign, you hit the target, you see the numbers drop. It requires logistics, but the human behavior required is minimal. Just take the shot.
Right?
Fighting NCDs is an entirely different universe of medicine. You can't just hand out a pill to cure a society-wide epidemic of cardiovascular disease. It requires changing deeply ingrained daily human behaviors. It requires complex regulation of food imports. It requires redesigning urban environments to encourage walking. And most expensively, it requires providing lifelong chronic care dialysis machines and continuous medication for diseases like diabetes.
Wow.
A health system built to administer vaccines on remote atolls is completely ill-equipped, both in hardware and software, to manage decades of chronic metabolic decay. It requires a complete paradigm shift in how they fund, train, and execute public health.
So they are fighting a war on three impossible fronts. They had the physical threat of climate change eroding their land, a demographic and health crisis straining their society, and an economy entirely dependent on the goodwill of foreign governments.
It's a lot.
To manage all of these compounding crises simultaneously, Kiribati requires incredibly strong governance, and they need a way to conquer their profound geographic isolation. Let's look at the governance data provided by the World Bank's Worldwide Governance Indicators, the WGI.
This part is fascinating.
The profile here is very specific and quite revealing.
Yeah.
Kiribati boasts exceptional political stability, ranking in the 91.0 percentile globally. For a developing nation, that is phenomenal.
Truly.
They also have decent voice and accountability, sitting at 48.3.
Yeah.
But then you look at regulatory quality, which is lagging significantly at 42.4, and the rule of law, which sits at 68.4. Why is there such a massive gap between their political stability and their ability to regulate?
The WGI data tells a very clear story about the realities of a microbureaucracy. That high political stability is no accident. It is their most crucial economic asset. Think back to the ODA.
The foreign aid.
Right. International donors, Japan, Australia, the World Bank, are deeply risk-averse. They will not pour hundreds of millions of dollars into 10-year infrastructure projects if they think the government might be overthrown next month or if the political system is chaotic. Kiribati's political stability is the bedrock that allows the aid model to function.
So they are peaceful, they are stable, but Why does the regulatory quality score so low? Is it tied back to those educational inefficiencies we saw earlier?
Absolutely. The intent to govern well is there, but the machinery of government requires specific human capital. Creating, implementing, and rigorously enforcing complex modern regulations, whether it's environmental codes, digital privacy laws, or complex financial audits, requires a deep bench of highly trained legal minds, economists, and administrators.
Which they are struggling to produce.
Exactly. When your total population is tiny and your educational system is struggling to push young men through the pipeline, building that deep institutional capacity is incredibly difficult. You simply don't have enough highly specialized experts to write and enforce the rules. The political will exists, but the bureaucratic execution struggles.
And to overcome both those bureaucratic hurdles and the immense physical distances between their islands, the data shows Kiribati is aggressively trying to bridge the digital divide. The numbers show fixed broadband subscriptions growing from a mere 322 up to a peak of around 850, with some fluctuations.
It's growing.
But more importantly, the number of secure internet servers per million people is steadily rising. The report makes it clear that digital infrastructure is a massive priority. I was thinking about this. Historically, the outrigger canoe was the technology that allowed Pacific Islanders to survive. It connected the islands, allowed for trade, and conquered the ocean.
I like where you're going with this.
Today, digital fiber optic cables are the new outrigger canoes. For a nation spread across millions of square miles of ocean, the internet isn't a luxury for streaming movies. It is the literal shipping lane for their entire service-based economy.
That is the perfect way to conceptualize it. We established earlier that they cannot competitively export physical goods. If your physical geography traps you, you have to transcend the physical space. You have to trade data, services, and digital connectivity.
Right.
A strong digital infrastructure allows a remote island resident to do administrative work for a company in Australia. It allows the government to manage its international fishing registries in real time. It allows doctors in the capital to do telehealth consultations with patients on outer atolls. It is the bridge over the ocean. In the 21st century, a service-based microstate simply cannot function, let alone grow, without robust digital connectivity.
So as we pull together all these complex threads from the massive amount of data we've explored today, the geographic vulnerability, the opening of the demographic window, the shift in health outcomes, the massive reliance on external aid, we have to ask, what does Kiribati's actual path forward look like? Based on the 15-page synthesis report, there are 4 main strategic pillars they must execute to survive.
Let's hear them.
First is climate resilience. Given that brutal reality of having over 67% of their land below 5 meters, every single dollar of infrastructure investment must prioritize climate adaptation. If a new road, clinic, or seawall isn't designed to withstand rising sea levels and intense storms, it is a waste of capital. Adaptation is the prerequisite for existence.
Absolutely. What's the second?
Second is economic diversification. They have to break the fragile, total reliance on official development assistance and basic services. The report suggests they must explore sustainable, high-value tourism and aggressively deepen their integration into the global digital economy. They need to generate their own capital.
Agreed. They need to own more of their economic destiny.
Third is human capital. They have this massive temporary youth bulge. They have to leverage their high basic literacy rates, but crucially, they must solve the inefficiency in their schools. Specifically, they have to figure out how to re-engage the young men who are falling behind the women in the human capital index. You cannot build a resilient nation if nearly half of your youth are structurally left behind.
You need everyone on the superhighway.
Exactly. And finally, public health. There needs to be a radical, ground-up restructuring of the entire health system. They have to transition away from just the old playbook of fighting infectious diseases and build a system capable of managing the chronic, expensive, and culturally complex crisis of non-communicable diseases.
If they can balance those 4 pillars, they don't just survive. They create a blueprint for sustainable modernization in the face of profound vulnerability. But it is a monumental task. It requires a flawless dynamic balance between mitigating their inherent physical risks and maximizing their global digital connectivity.
Which brings me to a final, slightly provocative thought I want to leave you with. Based on everything we've uncovered today, think about the unique situation Kiribati is in. You have a sovereign nation whose physical land is at constant existential risk of vanishing beneath the waves.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, Their people are becoming highly educated. They're increasingly digitally connected to the global economy. And they possess an incredibly strong, stable political identity. So if the worst-case climate scenario happens, what does a virtual or borderless nation look like in the 21st century? If the physical islands eventually go under, but the people, the data, the financial assets, and the political structure remain intact, does the sovereign entity of Kiribati survive in the cloud? The physical ground beneath their feet may not be permanent, but perhaps the nation they are building is. It's something for you to think about until our next deep dive.